Heyo, I'm recording this one right after my last video. Same beer I was on. To be honest, I'm recording this and I'm not even sure if it will ever actually be uploaded because we'll see how it goes. But I was having a thought today about BSBs in general. So anyone who knows me, well, not anyone who knows me, but people who I've discussed this with will understand. I'm pretty anti-BSB in general. So, although they are armies that are quite fickle with leadership, with my beast herds and with my ogres, I really try to avoid running a BSB. With my beast herds, I've overcome the problems of that with the fact that, like in my best list, I've got my Chariot Star, who have the Soothsayer in there so they can reroll panics if they need to. One of them's a Shamanism Master, and the fact that I have two Masters gives me enough spells where I can take, whenever I need it in terms of like the opposing army, Savage Fury and the Beast Herd Hereditary to ignore fear. Which is the big thing, basically, because taking a fear test on Leadership 8 without a reroll can really change how a combat is likely to go. Those are two spells that have quite low casting values. So oftentimes I can get one of those off and get another spell off in my face. In fact, most of the time I can get one of those off and I can get another one of those off in the face. So fear is a problem with that list, with the Chariot Star, but my magic is able to overcome it. Elsewhere in the list, my main things are 4 monsters. Gortax don't really care. Gortax are also often far enough away that even having a BSB, they likely wouldn't have a reroll to their Stubborn check or their Primal Fury check. There are definitely some things that you could do to make them more reliable. Like, if you had a BSB, you might position the BSB to put them in Gortax range, particularly if you had a fast one like a Centaur or something. But I don't think that the Gortax are too adversely affected based on not having a BSB. Yes, Stubborn without BSB is obviously worse, but with a Gortax, Stubborn is almost like a bonus. Like, you don't send him into many combats where you're like, hey, I'm going to lose this, and I don't mind losing the Gortax doing it. Like, either you don't engage those combats, or you go, cool, I'm going to send him in, I'm going to kill a character, like, most likely is the reason. So I'm going to send him in, going to kill a character, and then if they don't kill me, like the unit, I'll be stubborn and I'll probably hold. But usually if you're doing something like that, you're like, if the Gortax runs or if the Gortax dies, I'm okay with it. The Giants aren't fearless, but they're single models. They're usually outside the bubble. A BSB likely wouldn't help them anyway. And I usually try and keep them like 6 inches away of other things that might die around them. And being immune to terror, not taking panic from wounds, because they're a single model, like obviously all helps with that. So my Beast Herd list, I'm able to build around not having a BSB. If I was to run a list with, say, like probably the most important example would be a big block of Longhorns, where you put a Beast Chief or a Beast Lord in there to make them stubborn. You don't want to run that unit without a BSB, because one of the reasons you're running it is to have a stubborn block. And if you run a stubborn block without a reroll, it's like not really why you bought the unit. Because they become a lot less reliable as soon as you don't have the reroll. So there are lists where you would take a BSB. Particularly, like I'm talking about beast herds at the moment, but just in general, some lists require a BSB to work their best. But there's a lot of ways that you can build an army that don't require a BSB. I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. I had it in my mind when I was watching UFC earlier. I was like, this is what I want to say tonight. But sort of struggling sometimes with exactly what I want to define at the moment. So if you're running a list with a BSB, one of the things that I think is a problem is you often have, and this is, I mean, Like, I'm not talking about, really high-level play. Like, the best players of the game don't need to watch this video. They don't need to listen to this. And it probably doesn't apply to them. But a lot of people I find who are running a BSB are unhappy and, like, it's a big problem for them whenever they fail a test. Now, if you've played as much ninth as me, and I've played a lot of ninth, like, I've seen a lot of failed, like, Leadership 9 rerollable tests. Leadership 10 is actually, like, I can probably count on one hand the amount of times I've seen a Leadership 10 rerollable test fail. But Leadership 9 rerollable, that seems to fail more times than I'd be comfortable with. And that's one of the reasons why I sort of moved away from running a BSB. It started with my ogres when I was running them. And I basically just decided, look, if I just take like the elements of my ogre list, you know what, I'm going to bring it up and I'm going to discuss it. So one sec. Alright, had to go a weird way to get this back, because as soon as I brought this up, I'd like resized to fit my camera, and then I couldn't figure out how to do it. So we've gone a bit of a circuitous route, but here we are. We have reached it. Can I make this bigger? Is that going to make it easier to see? There we go. Okay, that's nice. Okay, so this is where it is now. It's gone through a few variations, but basically the idea that I came up with here was I went, what have I got that matters? I have a big block of mercenary veterans. What did I have previously? I had a big block of bruisers and I had a big block of tuskers. And I was like, when I play ogres, I can't rely on steadfast, because usually, you have one, maybe, or you probably have two, maybe three ranks with your big blocks. If I lose a combat, there's a lot of things that are breaking my steadfast anyway. So a BSB doesn't help me much, in my opinion, on break tests, because if I'm not going to be steadfast, then it's like, well, maybe I'll be testing on, if I lose, or maybe I'll be testing on Leadership 5. And whether or not I have a BSB, I don't want to do that. So I essentially just looked at it and went, cool, what does a BSB give me other than reroll break tests? The main one is reroll panic tests. March tests and all those kind of things, redirect tests, they're all important, but the two biggest ones to me seem to be reroll break tests, reroll panic tests. So in this list that I started out with, I had a big block of bruisers, big block of merc vets, big block of tuskers. All of them had a banner of discipline, and I went, cool, that's as good as a BSB would give me, because I don't want to rely on a BSB for break tests anyway, and if I am, I'm not winning. Like, if I rely on a break test with ogres, typically, and I need the BSB, then I probably haven't played well. I've probably gotten lucky to stay in, because I've probably taken negative modifiers, and those negative modifiers, take a couple of extra wounds or do a couple of wounds less, all of a sudden it's on a, you shouldn't be passing it, basically. One issue that this caused was a vulnerability to single models, because they're one of the things that probably don't break ogres steadfast when you've got a block. But regardless, that was basically my thinking. Like, if I don't want to rely on break tests ever with ogres, then a BSB's only good, or primary function is panic tests, and I can simulate that with banners of discipline. So I don't want to pay 300 or 400 points for a model who really is only bringing to the army reroll march tests, reroll redirect tests. It's evolved since then for various reasons, because my tuskers kept failing panic checks. So I ended up bringing in Rockorix. I decided I wanted a Hunter on a Rockorix, and yada yada yada, not all that important. But basically, now I've gotten to the point where I go, cool, I've got my general in a unit of merc vets. They're not going to fail panic. I don't, like, if I have to take break tests, not having a BSB occasionally might be bad, but usually if I've got myself in the situation where they're taking a break test, I've played poorly anyway. Everything else in this list takes panic. The Frost Mammoth, the least of all. I mean, Frost Mammoth and the Mammoth Hunter on Rockorix don't. except for units. Well, the Frost Mammoth units dying within it. The Rock Rocks doesn't at all. But with everything else, usually, and I should qualify this by saying, like, look, this probably isn't like you're going to win the ETC if you take this Ogres list, but this is an Ogre list that is good enough for the Australian meta to do fairly well with, because I have done fairly well with this in the Australian meta. If you take it to the highest level, maybe it's not good enough. However, the reason why it's not good enough is not, in my opinion, that it doesn't have a BSB. There are other issues. Regardless of all of that, every unit in here that may fail a panic test, you're able to play it like, I mean, 2 Bombardiers panicking because like one of them took some wounds and then fled through the other one. Whatever. It's not a disaster. You will end up playing oftentimes to be like, all right, well, I'll make sure they don't flee through each other because I don't want to have cascading panics. You end up sort of playing more cleanly with your discipline because you know you don't have that safety net of just going, oh, well, I've got a reroll, so I'm going to rely on that, right? So what I think this Ogre list was able to help me with is basically going, cool, I'm not just going to go into things and rely on passing a break test. I'm not just going to push my models up and rely on passing the panic test. What I have to do is I have to take away those moments of where I let poor luck influence the game, right? So, because I don't have a BSB, the list is less forgiving than having a BSB. But I have advantages that come from that. So one of them is the fact that I've got 400 extra points. So I've got an extra unit of Merc Vets and an extra unit of Chaff, say, right? I've got that because I don't have a BSB. Another advantage, which I think is, it's sort of not an obvious advantage, but I think it is an advantage, is the fact that because I don't have a BSB, I have no real reason to play within my bubble. So I've got a Leadership 8 General, and I go, Leadership 8's not that much better than Leadership 7. Merc Vets already have Leadership 8. Bruisers already have Leadership 8. There's a lot of reasons, basically, where I get to go with this army. Cool. I'm going to put my units where I think they're going to be most effective. If I had a BSB, I might be more tempted to go like, well, yes, they'd be most effective out on this flank, but then I'm also more likely to lose them. So not having to worry about that so much and going like, well, look, it doesn't matter where I put them, they're not going to have a reroll, they're not going to have that much help from having a general nearby. I'm going to put them where I think they're best in the army. So the end result with this Ogre army is that typically I can play a lot wider than my opponents. Whereas most opponents are inside their general and BSB bubble, this one can go I can go wherever I want. You know, if we play Spoils of War objective, a lot of the time I can go, I have a reasonable chance at all of these objectives, and you need to stop me from getting them. It's a really good army to play Spoils of War with. And there's a lot of times, and I think I've got a whole tournament with this list on my channel. And there's a lot of times where you can see things will panic and shit will go wrong. But things panicking is not that big an issue. It's obviously bad, but when you've designed a list and when you've written a list and when you're playing a list of this style and you know that panics are a problem and panics will happen, you play it differently, and part of that difference is playing to avoid those situations coming up and the situations being a problem. And I had some games yesterday. I played 3 games at 3,000 points. Just me and a few mates around at someone's house. And one of my opponents, I was playing against Dread Elves. And he got a bit unlucky. He got, definitely unlucky, basically. Because his Hydra panicked on Leadership I assume it's 8. So probably on leadership 8 with a reroll. And then his spears panicked on leadership 8 with a reroll. Because the Hydra ran through them. And it was one of those situations where you're like, yep, like, that's definitely unlucky. But those sort of situations come up all the time when people have a reroll. And I'm not even necessarily, like, if he didn't have a BSB, it doesn't necessarily mean that he would have played the game super differently. Because I don't really think that much of what he did was, like, a mistake in terms of, like, positioning or whatever else. But sort of thinking about it, I was like, I feel like that's the kind of problem that a lot of my lists avoid. Where, like with this list, for instance, the tribesmen, I don't give a shit. The tribesmen are like just another unit that I don't really care if they panic. But I used to have a big block of bruisers who were like I don't know, maybe 700 points. And because I only had one general, the general would generally go in the Merc Vets because the Merc Vets needed the immunity to panic more than the bruisers. And I found that there were times when the bruisers would just run away. There were also times when the bruisers just suck at hitting and lose a combat. But one of the things I sort of changed in it was I was like, well, you know, these bruisers aren't reliable because even with a reroll to panic and leadership 8, that's something that is failable enough that I can lose a game based on that. So I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to take that unit. It's not worth it. And that's sort of the thing that I was thinking about yesterday, where I was like, you've got this big block of spears who, like, it's a good unit. And they had the always +1 to wound banner, so like rather than losing it after the first turn, they've got it always. And this is sort of by the by, but like he had his general in there who was a Temple Exarch, whatever the unit is, or whatever the character is, originally, and it killed itself to a miscast on like turn 1. But if it had that guy in there, assuming he didn't die, and it had a banner of discipline, it's like, well, that just avoids that entire situation. That unit can now no longer panic. You don't have to worry about this. I don't know. What's the chance of failing a rerollable 8? Maybe like 5%. But, you know, if I play 100 games in a year, that means that that'll happen like 5 times. And every single time I'll be shitty about it. So, I think there's something to be gained and to be thought about at a certain level of 9th Age. Like, I don't know when it would start necessarily. I think it stops at about ETC level. Because if you're at about ETC level or you're pushing for ETC, you probably have a good enough understanding of the game that you don't really need to worry about improving your game in this way. But, so, if you're starting out in 9th, you've got a lot to learn and a lot going on, and basically you should pretty, like, obviously it depends on the army, but pretty much you should take a BSB. It gives you an extra reliability, it gives you extra help when you make mistakes. It sort of helps you from mistakes that you're definitely going to make. It helps them not be so bad for you. So when you're starting out with 9th, you should definitely take a BSB. But I think there's a point where you get to a certain level of experience and competence with 9th, up until the point where you're like pushing for ETC-ish level. And I say ETC-ish level, I don't mean that you have to actually be playing in the ETC or going for it. I just mean that sort of standard of play. But there's a big middle ground where I think a lot of people sit. And it's where I still sit. Like, I'm not, you know, holier than thou and saying this is, like, if you want to be as good as me. Like, nothing like that. But something that I think has really helped me get better is the fact that I've gone, I'm not going to play with a BSB in these armies that typically a lot of people would say, no, you need a BSB, there's no choice doing else, like anything else. Like, I think a lot of people would say that Beast Herds and Ogres are an army that need a BSB. like Highborn elves with their martial discipline, with div magic, with maybe a fleet officer or something, and leadership 10, they can get away with not having a BSB much more easily because it's sort of like you've got other ways to pass your leadership. Ogres and beast herds don't really have that. So a lot of people would think that those two armies are two armies that need BSBs. But in my opinion, there's a lot to be gained from playing an army that is susceptible to leadership and doesn't have a BSB. Because I think there's just there's a learning curve involved with playing that way. There's there's things that you can do basically to minimize the impact that not having a BSB has. And they're things that you often don't explore and you often don't think about until you've actually played that way. So, for me, I would think that the way that I've played without a BSB influences the way that I would play with a BSB. So I could put a BSB into this ogre list, and you know what? Say it costs me the extra unit of Merc Vets and the Kineta, like whatever. The list is slightly weaker in that sense in that I have less threats, but the list is stronger and that it's more reliable. But I would still I'd still be very tempted to be like, I'm going to take Banner of Discipline on my Merc Vets because Leadership 8 with a reroll is not good enough. And I want to make sure they auto-pass their panic checks. I'd still play in a way that says, I can't make this charge knowing that it's 60-40 in my favor because if I take a break test, I will run. If I had a BSB and I hadn't played for so long without a BSB, I might do that and go like, oh yeah, but you know, it's pretty unlucky if I lose the combat, fail my break test, and fail my reroll. But I think playing without a BSB helps you to sort of adapt to a more risk-averse style. Not necessarily risk-averse is like the way to win Night Gauge, but it definitely contributes. But like, I guess it helps, in my opinion, in your ability to evaluate what a good risk is. So, the maths obviously plays a factor where you can be like, something that I wouldn't do without a reroll to leadership might be something that I would do when I have a reroll to leadership. But I think there's a sort of a big grey area between those two where it's like, oh, should I do this? Where having a BSB makes you go, I'm going to take the risk. And not having a BSB makes you go, I'm not going to take the risk. I'm going to play a different way. I'm going to play a different style. I'm going to approach the situation differently. And I think that's almost something that, like, having the crutch of having a BSB makes it hard for you to work on and hard for you to develop. So, sort of trying to think of like a grand overarching point to be like, and now you can see from all of my arguments, here is what I mean, and here is the way to be better at ninth. But I don't think there's anything that significant in terms of as an overarching theme to what I'm saying, but I guess the main thing I think is that as soon as I started to play this ogre army without a BSB, well, not this ogre army, but a similar ogre army, and I consciously made a decision like, I don't think a BSB is worth it. I'm going to figure out a way that this is going to work without a BSB. I think that my macro play improved immensely. Like, I think that the way that I approached the game from the outset, like I was noticing at basically events, I was sitting at the table, looking at the terrain, thinking about my army, thinking about my opponent's army, and there was just a lot more to it where I was like, okay, where do I need my pieces? what are they going to do in this game? And all of it was sort of like basically relying on the fact that I was thinking like, okay, like I can't lose a combat that I need to win. I can't rely on something to pass panic or anything like that. So like, you know, my tigers, I can't put them to chaff a monster and go, cool, that's fine. Like, I've got a BSB nearby. They're probably going to pass the leadership 8, right? So everything that I did in that game, I had to be, or in the games that followed, I was like, I have to get this right. And sort of what that generally took the form of was that I'd play for the objective and sort of like the way that I sort of deployed and the way that I was going to approach the game was like, my main aim was like, I'm going to win the objective and I'm going to protect myself from everything going bad. That doesn't always work, obviously, because sometimes my opponent plays better, sometimes I make mistakes, there are issues that come about, but a lot of the time I found in my games, I was sort of sitting there and going, I know what's going to happen in this game. Because I know what I'm relying on, I know what I'm not relying on, and even if I got the bad luck where I was like, oh shit, I'm failing every single panic test, I'd be sitting there still going like, that's okay, because I'm allowing these panic tests to take place. I know that I'm not going, like, I know that I can't rely on passing them, so if I'm going to let a panic test take place, it's only ever going to be a panic test that I don't mind taking. Obviously, there are opponents that can outplay you, that can, you know, screw up your plans, but it's the sort of thing that when I had a BSB, I'd be sitting there going like, cool, I'll take this panic test and I'll pass it. But then you might not pass it, and then you might sit there and go, I'm in a lot of trouble because I failed that test. And it's something that I think everybody should try and sort of make their army work when they don't have the redundancy of having a BSB, basically. Because I think that having the BSB just sort of forces you to rely on that crutch and hurts your development as a player. So you probably shouldn't try it if you're just starting out. You probably don't need to try it if you're one of the top level players. But when you're in that middle range, who's like, you know, where I sit, where, you know, you could play a good game against an ETC player, and you probably lose, but you can like be competitive. You know, they're not just stomping you. But you could also lose against someone who's like much less experienced and maybe with a much worse list than you because things go wrong and you don't play well, right? It's sort of a region where when you come to the board, like anything can happen. I think that you get better as a player by going, I'm not going to let luck define this game. And one of the ways to sort of force yourself to think about doing things differently is by not taking a BSB, basically. That, I think, is basically all I wanted to say. Sort of like a long, rambling way to get to my relatively simple point. But I hope it helps some people to think about it. I'm happy to answer any questions if you're, you know, if I wasn't clear, if you're wanting to know more. But pretty much my suggestion to you is for like 80% of the player base out there, write some lists that you think will work without a BSB, try them, and see how they work, see what you need to change, do enough to make them work. Some lists are not going to work without a BSB, but you probably should be able to figure out a list for any army that works without a BSB. And it doesn't even need to be wholly reliant on like Fearless or Unbreakable or whatever else. I'd urge you to try it. To figure it out, make it work for you. Because I think at the end of the day, even when you go back to an army and you're like, I'm still going to take a BSB here, I think you'll be a better player overall because of how you've developed in like your risk evaluation skills, basically. That's all I've got. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was interesting to you. Chat to me if you've got any questions. If you want to say, Max, you're an idiot. Yeah. Thanks, guys. I'll catch you next time.